Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We are here with the incredible Dr. David Salomon, and we have been going over his beautiful new book, The Seven Deadly Sins. If you haven't got it yet, that might be a sin in itself. I hope you decide to pick it up. We've covered pride, we've covered lust, and now we are on to anger, all the way from the Western ideas to the Bible, and then we're going to get into some genetics. And without any further ado, let me just introduce it. Maybe you could introduce it with the quote from Paul Verily about anger, how this whole thing starts off.
Do I have a quote from Valerie about anger?
I have it right here. I think it was we are aware.
We're aware that a civilization has the same fragility as a life. Yes.
Gosh, that's deep right there.
Opens. That is correct. Thanks for having me back here, George. Appreciate it.
I'm excited to be here. And, the beginning of this chapter starts off with Western history and how it's been predicated on feelings of anger and the Luddite movement to I Love Lucy. Where do you feel like jumping in over there?
Yeah. I mean, it's this actually is the first chapter that I wrote for the book originally. Somebody came to me and said, they were doing a book called Understanding Angry Groups. Which eventually was published, a nice volume, and it has a mix of all different disciplines in it. And a colleague who was one of the editors said, "Why don't you write a chapter about anger in the Bible? Because that's my area of studying and teaching is often the Bible." And I said, "Oh yeah," I said that could be interesting. And so I wrote the chapter, and it was published. And then the publisher asked me if I would do all seven deadly sins, do them all. And so this chapter was actually the first one that I wrote. And what's interesting is that if you study the history of anger as just an idea, and then you attempt to try to use your understanding of that history to figure out what in the heck is going on today, it's pretty frustrating because the answers don't necessarily present themselves. And I think that one of the key differences is in discussing the difference between anger and hatred. And a lot of what we're dealing with today globally, we're currently talking and we're in the midst of what the horrors are going on over in the Ukraine. A lot of the global conflict that occurs in the world today has more to do with hatred than it does anger. And how can we really talk about those two things? The sort of the dictionary definitions and the distinction in the dictionary is that hatred is prolonged. Anger tends to be brief. So you can't sort of stay angry. The definition of the word kind of tells us that you can't do that. If anger is prolonged, it turns into hatred. And of course, hatred is much more deep-seated in our beings and difficult to get rid of, and oftentimes is the motivator for the kind of conflict that we see every day, whether it's so-called now hate crimes or the kind of war that we're seeing going on in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, it reminds me of our good friend Blake wrote a poem about anger, and he says, "I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not. My wrath did grow." Yeah. And it seems like that is the festering of anger can become the cancer of hatred. Like, is there something that we can do, you think, to maybe? I guess if we could solve the problem of hatred, we would be a better world. But what do you see as maybe something we can do to stop anger from becoming hatred?
It's tough. And I'll tell you, I'm as guilty as anybody. And it's interesting because I was looking online last night in preparation for our talk today, and there's a new poll that you can actually take. It's a survey about anger. And it asked a series of 38 questions that you respond to on a scale. And then it gives you back some sort of generic feedback on how angry you are compared to the general population. And I'm sad to say I did this morning. I'm pretty angry, but I'm also having kind of a rough day. But I think that the interesting thing for me, at least personally, the way to counterbalance anger is to look at the corresponding virtue, which is patience. And when you talk about patience, I have not done a lot of work looking at patience as a Judeo Christian virtue. I have looked more and studied more personally about patience and its role in a Buddhist context, a Buddhist lifestyle. And is the famous, unfortunately just died, Thich Nhat Hanh, wrote a wonderful book called Anger, and the subtitle of it is "A Wisdom for Cooling the Flames." And his entire, of course, his entire advice is based on the kind of mindfulness that he wrote about throughout his entire life. But he really is counseling patience, that when you feel that emotion on the rise, that you take one or two steps back and engage in some patience and some reflection and some, for him, a lot of breathing. It's that old sort of, count to 10. Too much of what we do in response, I think, to our anger is rather knee jerk. We do it thoughtlessly. And that's where we get into a lot of the problems.
Yeah, I agree. It's such a powerful emotion, and that's probably why it's one of the seven deadly sins. It has this ability to overwhelm us or even
Yes.
take control of us, and it's. I often wonder if humor could be some sort of antidote to anger. I think we're going to get into that in a
Yeah.
little bit, but
Yeah, it may be. I mean, that's part of, I mean, I use humor a lot, and maybe that's my way of dealing with it. I don't know. But I think you're right. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, just as we were talking about with lust and pride, is the uncontrolled nature of it. Anger uncontrolled is really what this is, the sin, right?
yeah,
Everyone has some anger, and I don't think that's necessarily the issue. The issue is when it becomes out of, when it grows to be out of your control, and essentially just sort of take over and is driving the bus. I think it's a metaphor I used the last time. What I think is interesting is the connection then when you get to that point between anger and fear, and that anger can often exhibit itself as either a response to fear or as the antidote to fear. I'm afraid of something, and so as a result, I don't like it. It's Edward Said's notion of the other, right? I don't like what I don't understand. So that can grow to become, well, I'm angry about that because I don't understand it, and I take my anger out on that subject rather than the problem is really me because I don't understand it. It reminds me of students will say, oh, I hate math, right? It's like, well, why? Well, I don't understand it. Well, that's why you hate it, right? It's pretty simple. And not to use math, but it's a simple equation, right? I mean, if you hate something, you're probably not going to like it, and vice versa. You don't do well at it, and as a result, you're frustrated with it. And so I think that patience is probably, we say patience is a virtue, right? And it is in this case, but it's difficult in our modern world to handle that. And I mentioned in the chapter various sort of pop culture stuff, early 20th century in particular. I love Charlie Chaplin, and scenes from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, where he essentially is really commenting on our modern existence and how fast things are moving. And we sometimes will react to that by lashing out. And you see it, I think, with people every day, even if it's just in the grocery store, right? I mean, it's that old thing about how you sort of reach your boiling point, right? And when something reaches its boiling point, it boil over, and that's where the anger comes in.
Yeah, I think you mentioned speed, how it ramps up our emotions. And for those of who are unaware, could you explain to them the scene in I Love Lucy, where she's working at the chocolate factory?
Oh, that's a great scene. Yeah. So in I Love Lucy, the wonderful uh, sitcom from the 50s, Lucy and Ethel are hired to work at a chocolate factory. They have to wrap the pieces of chocolate as they come down a conveyor belt in an assembly line. And they have to keep up. And so the two of them are standing there next to each other, and they are wrapping. Each piece has to be wrapped individually. This is before machines really were able to do this, and everything was automated. And they're doing okay, and eventually, after not too long, of course, they start to fall behind. And Lucy starts making up for this by taking the pieces of chocolate and first stuffing them in her mouth, and then putting them into her shirt because she's got to hide it from the forelady who's about to come back. And the forewoman comes back in after she stopped the assembly line, and both Lucy and Ethel are standing there, mouths full of chocolate, and Lucy's got tons of chocolate in her blouse, all weighed down. And the forewoman looks at the assembly line and says, "Okay, good, speed it up." And of course, I mean, that just completely derails them. But that's kind of, I mean, and that was the 1950s. That was what, 70 years ago. And now everything in our lives moves so quickly that it is hard to keep up with the assembly line. And oftentimes our resulting emotion is anger. And the way a lot of folks deal with it, myself included, is to every night just to do a little bit of meditation. I believe that in some ways it's the old metaphor of the pressure cooker, right? I mean, the meditation at least lets some of the steam out, so it doesn't explode. But I would think that without that, if you don't have that release, you end up with extreme hatred, which is
Yeah.
really ugly in so many ways, right?
Yeah, that brings us to the point where there's a difference between the way the West handles anger and the East handles anger. She kind of got into it a little bit. Could you flesh it out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's that fundamental thing about just the way that you got me there.
I do. It's a
Okay.
little. The sound is a little bit, kind of cutting out a little bit. Is it?
Let me check
Maybe.
my mic here. Hang on.
Okay. It's not bad, but it keeps cutting a little bit, like a little delay.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds a little better. I'll let you know if it starts crushing again.
Yeah, yeah. So the fundamental difference between the West and the East look at anger is again that external internal thing, right? I mean, in the West in general, and I'm speaking in generalities now. In general, if I'm angry at something or at someone. Whereas in the East and Eastern philosophy, really the impulse is instead to look within. And oftentimes the Buddhist texts will talk about the anger being within you, and that you need to look at that and come to sort of reconciliation with it. Whereas in the West, we often are looking for something to sort of hang our blame on, right? It's the blame game again. I want to blame something for the reason why I feel like this. When in most of the Buddhist texts, the response would be that you're to blame. It's your problem, not someone else's, and you need to figure this out. And I think that difference it's such a startling difference of the way that we look at the world, really. And again, I go back to somebody like Thich Nhat Hanh, who, if you read him and his counseling about mindfulness, which is it's not, Buddhism doesn't have the market on that, Certainly, somebody like Basil Pennington in the Cistercian tradition who came up with centering prayer. That's mindfulness. We see it. It's just called different things, right? It has different names. And if we can engage with that, we certainly would be better off. I feel like something's going on that's funky with my sound, though.
Yes, there was a little bit of an echo. It seems better now. I
Okay.
wonder, is there there could be a bandwidth issue with us
Yeah.
being so far apart or whatever, or having
Okay.
multiple screens open or something like that.
Okay.
However, I think it sounds fine. There's a few hiccups
Is it
here and there.
okay?
However, yeah,
Okay.
it is good. It is
All
good.
right.
And it brought me to another point when we were talking about the East versus West, and it seems to me that mindfulness is the answer to anger in the East. However, I was curious if you think that maybe stand-up comedy is the answer to anger in the West. It seems to be a uniquely Western, or at least it seems like it evolved in the West. And
Yeah.
you have some incredible stories about seeing the great Lewis Black and his his response to anger. Could you maybe share that with
Yeah,
the
I
folks?
remember the first time I saw Lewis Black, and I was actually genuinely concerned for the health of the man. I thought he was just going to have a stroke right there on the stage. He was so angry, and I remember going home, and I had to sort of Google him at the time. You could already do that, just to see was this a persona or was this really who he was? And I was, certainly relieved to know that much of it was a persona, and that he wasn't going to have a heart attack right there on the stage. But I think that the connection between humor and anger is interesting, because if you go back to the earliest days of film, for example, and you go back to like the silent slapstick comedies of the 1910s and 20s and then the 30s, um, much of that, by the time you get to the 30s, is a direct sort of reaction to the Depression, the Great Depression. People were literally depressed and also financially depressed, and they wanted to laugh. And so you went to the movies and you could see Abbott and Costello, you could see the Three Stooges, you could see Laurel and Hardy. It was this physical humor, which, for whatever reason these days is only mostly enjoyed by men. I don't know why. Most women, of course, famously find the Three Stooges ridiculous and don't understand why we think they're so funny. But they're beating the hell out of each other and we're laughing. And I think maybe part of that is the cathartic bit, right? We're letting go of our anger by watching them engage in that kind of physical activity. And it may also be the part of the justification for why physical sports are so popular in the U.S. and globally. But in the U.S., I mean, if you look at professional football and how just basically violent it is as a game, it's all predicated on, let's hit the other guy as hard as we can and try to get the ball from him. And I'm a football fan. That is clearly, I mean, I remember my uncle watching television, watching the game when I was a kid, and I mean, boy, I mean, it was a cathartic experience for him. He would scream and yelling, and he'd yell at the TV, but you could tell it was a way of him getting some kind of a release on a Sunday afternoon that I think he needed. And so, that kind of sport, of course, goes back to the ancient world when those kinds of physical games were devised in order to keep the military occupied when they weren't at war. It's how the Olympics began. And this whole idea of engaging in that physical sport to have that kind of release when there's nobody to fight, as far as you're concerned, was a battle with another country.
Yeah, it's which brings us almost back to the East, like this interconnectedness, be it comedy to anger or mindfulness to understanding, or it's fascinating to think about how we have two hemispheres in the brain, the two sides there, and then we also have the East and the West, and we kind of need both of them in order
Yeah.
to really understand what it is we're angry about, or to find some understanding. And
Yeah.
that I thought it was also interesting to when you brought up anger in the Bible and how
Mhm.
there's so many different kind of takes on it versus the Old Testament versus the New Testament.
Yeah.
Maybe you could start with what Augustine writes about the anger of God seems
Yeah.
inconsistent with his beneficence.
Right. The Old Testament God is an angry dude. I mean, there's no getting around it. I mean, from the initial story in Genesis, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, his response is, "Get out of the garden. You're both going to die now." It seems rather harsh, and that doesn't really cease until we get to the New Testament. God is an angry figure in the Old Testament stories, whether he is directly punishing figures or punishing the people. We see it in the book of Exodus when Moses, for example, when he first comes down from Sinai with the tablets and sees the golden calf, and he gets so angry about the idolatry of the people while he was gone that he destroys the tablets, he throws them at the calf, and God punishes him for that by saying, "Okay, you can't go to the promised land now." And he, sure enough, dies on the other side of the river, looking at the promised land that he led the people to. Probably the most troubling story for my students when we look at this is the story of Isaiah, who's carrying one of the guys is carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and I think an ox stumbles, and he reaches down to grab the Ark to keep it from falling to the ground. And the Israelites have been strictly forbidden from touching the ark. And as a result of touching the ark, God smites him right on the spot. And you're like, wait a minute. And so we have to kind of look at the commentary in order to get what's going on there, because the commentators had the same problem looking at that and trying to explain it. And their response is, well, he didn't have faith that the ark would be able to support itself. And so as a result, he was punished. It seems, as my students would say, pretty lame, but it's what the commentators come up with for an explanation. And it's one of the only ones we've got, because it's a very strange story. Of course, once we get into the New Testament, there is very little in the gospel about Jesus being angry. And showing any kind of anger, with really one exception, and that's seen with the money changers when he throws over the tables. Other than that, most of what is in the New Testament comes from Paul, who is understandably and expectantly incredibly conservative about it, and essentially has the same feeling about anger that he does about lust, which is, if you feel angry, you've already committed the sin. It's not about necessarily the display of it, it's the thought of it. He wants us to be pure of mind, which is incredibly difficult to do. But again, when I deal with this with my students, I have to remind them that Paul was living at a different time.
Yeah.
He's living right after the death of Jesus. He is living at a time when he expected, Jesus said he was going to come back, and he's coming back like next week. You better get yourself in order here. And a lot of what he counsels in his epistles doesn't seem like it was necessarily meant for us to be living necessarily today in 2022. What he was thinking about would work in 50 and 60 AD. And I don't think he thought about the kind of data smog that we live in, and the fact that we have this bombardment of information hitting us and a life that moves so fast. I mean, I joke, but Paul walked around in sandals. And George, living in Hawaii, you may walk around in sandals too. I don't know, but maybe it's a Pauline thing for you. I don't know. But our pace of life is just different today.
Yeah, it really is. And getting back to in the beginning of the book, you talk about, even with the Luddites and I Love Lucy, there's been this form of dehumanization. And it's when we refuse to see the humanity in one another, it's easy to quantify people and look at them as a number and look at them as a means of production. But when we do that, we it makes me want to be more like the Old Testament God.
Yeah.
And and in a way, maybe that's the cycle that's kind of happening here. Maybe we're moving back into this angry side of the Old Testament, and we've gotten away from the Newer Testament because that's the time. You write something really profound. I thought that the Old Testament, a fool gives full vent to his anger, and it's aimed at the sinner. These are just kind of the thoughts that I had written down that came from the side. And then the New Testament is, in your anger, do not sin, aimed at the sin. So the Old Testament is aimed at the sinner. The New Testament is aimed at the sin. And it just seems like a nice evolution to
Yeah.
move towards, maybe when it was fresh, when it was this, it is aimed at the sinner, but it just brings me back to the
But you're
idea
right,
that,
though, George. Excuse me. I mean,
yeah, please.
maybe we are going back to that because now we do focus much more on punishing the sinner than we do the sin, which is much more of an Old Testament approach to things, and not necessarily the best way to go. I don't think it was. It's the way God operates in the Old Testament, but that is a different world. And we've got to remember that what's going on through most of those Old Testament stories is the attempt to establish Yahweh as the one God in a culture, in a world at the time, which was anything but monotheistic. And in fact, the three Western religions, the major Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are not really following monotheism at heart. They are monolatry, right? Monolatry is the acknowledgement that there are other gods, but we believe in this one. We're gonna stick with this one. So as you go through the Old Testament stories, there's still mention of some of those other gods that existed and that people were believing and worshiping. And one of the things that separates the Israelites, of course, is their devotion to this one God, Yahweh. And we're getting their story in the Old Testament. It's always interesting to look at some of the other texts that we have, and they're few and far between from the ancient world, of these cultures that instead responded to an alternate God, maybe had the same kind of monolatry with their God, but ours won out. And in many ways, a lot of the tales in the Old Testament are about Yahweh really winning out. I mean, he says when Moses goes up to Sinai, he says, I'm a jealous God. He even in some of the translations, and if you read the Hebrew, he calls himself jealous. He says, as if that's his name. He's angry.
Yeah. I wonder, let me throw this out at you here. Could it be that, like, the word of God, like in monotheism and Yahweh, he wants his word to be law. And nowadays, like you said, there's like a data smog. So there's all these chaos and different words out there. Might it be that returning to the word of God could be like returning to the truth of the world we live in? Like there's just so much data smog out there that the word can't get out. We can't agree on anything because no one knows what the truth is. And when you have no truth, all you have is correlation and no causation. And when you have correlation, that's like the weakest form of communication because it doesn't really mean anything. And like, that's why maybe there's so much anger out there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the contemporary world is certainly indicated by complexity, right? I mean, people will say it all the time as a cliche at this point, right? We live in complex times. Yes, we do. What does that mean? As opposed to living in simple times? I don't know. Is that the opposite? And certainly, if we look at ancient cultures as depicted in the Bible, they were living in much more simple times than we are when you compare it on that kind of a level. Is that necessarily, and I think you're right on the one hand, if we could get back to, and I think that's what the Buddhist texts try to teach, is to get back to that kind of simplicity. Because that simplicity, again, it's all about giving us the space to sit back and reflect. And maybe if I do that, I wouldn't be so angry at John if I had a chance to really think about this. We talk about today, and we throw around the phrase, well, you haven't walked in his shoes. You don't know what it's like. Well, no, I don't. And the next sentence would often be, and I don't have time to do that, right? And it's interesting that there's an event that goes on across the country. I participated in a couple times where men will walk in women's high heels. It's a walk against violence against women, and it is a walk in their shoes kind of thing. And man, those high heels are hard to walk in. But there is something about that, and I have tried to, over the years, even engage in that on like college campuses where I'll we'll be instituting some kind of a new policy or a new procedure, and I'll say to an administrator, we really need to spend a day walking in the students' shoes to see what that's actually like, because we've gotten so far away from that. And I think that that's culturally and socially, that's become a problem. We have people up on high who are making decisions about things that affect millions of people, but they really don't understand what those people are going through. And the resulting emotion that the people feel then is anger, right? I'm angry. I mean, I don't know what Jeff Bezos's day is like. I have no idea, you know, but he has no idea what my day is like, and he has no idea what the average worker in Amazon's day is like, I imagine. And they're constantly trying to tell us what that's like, but people don't want to listen, and they're not hearing. And the walking in someone's shoes, I think, is a very important thing to do. Whether it's just displaying the humanity that you feel for other people. I'm always baffled by colleagues who essentially ignore housekeepers and the cleaning staff in buildings, companies, wherever, as if they just don't exist. We have to acknowledge each other's humanity. That's the only solution to any of this. I mean, and that's really, in my book, that's the ultimate conclusion that I make, is it's all about acknowledging other people's humanity. And by that, we can acknowledge and improve our own humanity, our own humaneness, and what makes us human, and get back to that. In many ways, the technology has so gotten in the way of that. And it starts, as I mentioned before, go back to Chaplin and modern times. Look at Lang's Metropolis, where the workers are at the beginning of the film just robots basically walking into work. It's so startling. They were underground, and he cuts to the big wigs, of course, work up on the top floor, far away from the workers. And I think the reaction that a lot of people have today to that is to feel anger. And unfortunately, when it's left festering, it becomes hatred. And then we see the kinds of criminal acts that we witness, the kinds of the mass shootings, which, yes, oftentimes because someone is mentally ill. What does that mean? I mean, is somebody who's angry mentally ill? You could argue that. I mean, the DSM it covers anger. It tells us about it and how to deal with it. But it's we live in interesting times. Cliche. Put an asterisk over that, right? And it doesn't seem like we are going in the right direction on this. Not to go back to it, but I will, and to talk about Ukraine, because it's so in the forefront of our minds at the moment for many of us, and the millions of people who have left Ukraine now and are refugees, most of whom are children and women who left their husbands behind. And what's going to happen to them? how are we supposed to deal with that? And as human beings, we need to start figuring that out. We need to start figuring out how we're going to take care of each other on so many different levels. Because quite honestly, since World War One, we've done a pretty lousy job of it. And it is not, you know, we founded the United Nations after World War II, and the United Nations is a wonderful body. They've done great things. The problem is today they have teeth. And so, you know, they're coming out with these statements against Russia, against what Putin is doing, supporting the Ukrainians. But it's words. And we need actions more than words right now when it comes to dealing with people who need our help. I was driving home last night, and there were two folks sitting by the side of the road near the Dunkin' Donuts, clearly homeless. It was a couple. And the woman was, it looked to me, consoling the man. They were both sitting on the side of a curb. I could only see her because he was kind of hunched over, almost in a fetal position. And as I drove past, I couldn't help but wonder, what is the situation? What is their situation? How can I help? And I oftentimes will stop and try to help. And it's more than just giving them money. They need more than money. They need help. And we need to kind of reconfigure what that looks like to help other people. It's, yes, you know, it's great if you donated $10 to some fund that's going to help Ukrainian refugees. Wonderful. And that may be the only thing that you feel like you can do right now. We need to figure out a way that we could do more.
Yeah, I often wonder, like, how is it that we continually make the same mistakes? How is it possible that, like, we understand what war does? We understand what the mass productions of weapons does, and yet, you know, I was thinking about this yesterday. After 9/11, there was this camaraderie, albeit misplaced, but
Yeah.
there was this incredible, you know, idea of like, hey, we're all Americans, we're all this, you know. And I remember this. There was a campaign, and it was like this. There was an African American. It's like, I'm an American, and then a white guy, I'm an American, and like
Right.
we're all Americans. And it is possible, if our leaders wanted to unify our country, they could do it. You could have on CNN and Fox, like, hey, here's a young kid who designed this new thing that's going to help our country. Here's a young kid helping another kid. Like, we could have a really incredible campaign that unifies our country.
Yeah.
And so if we agree that we could do that, if the people in charge wanted to do that, they could. If we can agree to that, then we must also agree that they don't want to do that because they're not doing that. And I
Yeah.
think there's so many people right now that are just trying so hard to put gas in their tank, to talk to their parents, to help out the people in their neighborhood, that we need our leaders to step up and do what's right. And
We need them to lead.
we need them to lead. And do you think is that our fault for not putting the right leaders in charge, or what does that say about us? And how can we?
Leadership today is a very difficult issue, because, and part of it is, and it seems like a silly response, but part of it is, most of our countries have gotten so large that the idea that you would have one leader of that country is really kind of ridiculous. You know, I mean, I grew up in New York City. For years, there have been complaints that it's ridiculous to have one mayor for the whole city of New York. It's too big. One mayor can't govern the entire city. And to think that one person as president can govern the entire country of the United States, with its vast population, its geographic differences, its demographic differences, it's really kind of foolhardy. Nonetheless, that's the system we have. So what have we done? Well, have we elected the wrong folks? Maybe. Maybe it's the system that's problematic more than who we've elected. Not to go down that rabbit hole, but the system has certainly gotten in the way in recent years as far as the elections are concerned. But I think part of the greater issue here is not just the leaders, but we need to kind of reframe what it means to be a leader. What are we looking for? I mentioned last time we chatted that when Jimmy Carter mentioned that he had lusted in his heart, his poll numbers went down 15 points. He was still elected president. And then, later on, of course, we have Donald Trump, who, when he said what he said, was elected president a couple of weeks later. What does it mean to be a leader? What are we looking for? With the 24-hour news cycle and the internet now, we know much more about our leaders than we ever knew before. And so people will often say, well, I can't imagine that, I don't know, pick somebody. Herbert Hoover was ever like this. And it's like, probably was. You probably just didn't know about it. And so, I go back to the interesting sort of compact that FDR set up with the press, which was they would never film him in the wheelchair. They would never film him from the waist down in the wheelchair because he was afraid that was going to convey weakness. And the man brought us through World War II. So what are we looking for in a leader? And maybe it's not such a bad idea to go back to texts like the Bible and look at what those leaders were like. But to understand that they also were not perfect. Oftentimes students will go back and they'll write a paper about Moses as a great leader. I'll say, okay, what are you basing this on? They say, well, the stories in Exodus. And I'm like, well, that's the polished version of the story, right? I mean, there are a lot of other texts about Moses that you should look at. Philo of Alexandria, the Greek Jew philosopher who lived at the time of Jesus, wrote 2 volumes about Moses that are absolutely brilliant and are incredibly insightful about not only the good things, but also the bad things. None of us is perfect. And so I think part of the problem could be that we're looking for leaders who are. And we're not going to find that because, again, we're human beings. We're flawed. That's the nature of being a human being. And, I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and it was Patton Oswalt, who I really like. And he and his wife have a podcast that's called Did You Get My Text? It's a weekly podcast. And he was talking about the fact that he's hoping that in a couple of weeks, something horrible doesn't come out about Vladimir Zelensky, because we all love the guy. And we're hoping that, something isn't revealed in a couple of weeks that all of a sudden makes him into a horrible figure and just we all feel terrible. And Patton looked back at Mario Cuomo, who we were all, cheering on during COVID. And then all of a sudden, talk about a fall from grace. We're looking for people to be perfect. People are not perfect. They are not perfect. We sin. We're human beings. If we weren't, we'd be saints. And I don't know anybody who is. I don't know anybody who's even, in the running. We've all got our flaws. And I think probably one of the best things that we can do, and again, this is a kind of a Jungian approach, is to do that reflection and that to look inside and realize and understand what our own flaws are, and to understand how we can negotiate and reconcile those flaws to still leading a productive and what Aristotle would call a good life.
Yeah, that's That's a lot right there. I couldn't agree more. And maybe that's one reason like we are so angry is because like we have such high standards for other people, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
it's like, why is this leader not perfect? Or you know, and the truth is maybe the things we're most angry about in the other are the things we're most upset about ourselves. You know, and if we could, that takes us right back to the Eastern philosophy is like, oh, maybe these people are mirrors. Maybe these people that you despise, that you see the negative in, is something that you're being shown because it's something that you should be working on.
Right.
You know, I can't tell you how many times I've got upset at people and I thought I knew why. And after some meditation or reflection, I almost have to put my head and my hands on my knees and go, gosh darn it, I'm the one.
Yeah.
It's me. I'm
It's
the
me.
one that doesn't like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that you know, if anger could be turned around, or you know, it's interesting to think about anger and comedy like a magnet. Maybe they're not the opposite, but they're the extreme ends of the same because they
Mhm.
have the same energy just going the other way. And if we can begin to see the things we're angry about as things that we need to work on ourselves, that causes me to laugh sometimes, you know, because there's
Yeah.
nothing left to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's having the ability, I guess, to laugh at yourself and to be self-deprecating, which is really, oftentimes viewed as being such a positive trait, and that idea of not taking yourself too seriously, right?
Yeah.
And I think that maybe uh, what happens if someone is taking themselves too seriously and is probably somewhere on the pride spectrum, because they're a little bit too self-involved, they have then that inability to really relate to other people and understand what's going on because it's all about them. But they also have the inability to really do the reflection. They can't look within. They're unable to. They look at the mirror and all they see is wonderful, right? Whereas, George and I look at the mirror and go, "Oh God, you again?" Um,
You know, you brought up an interesting point when you spoke about pride briefly. Do you think that maybe some of these sins, like let's just take anger for example, do you think that anger can be a bridge or a shortcut to pride and lust, like they kind of feed off each other?
yeah, I mean, often all of these sins do have a connection. They are all connected. And in fact, I mean, in the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon to see there lots of art. You can Google it and find a lot of the images of the tree of vices,
Mm.
right? And pride is usually at the base of the trunk because that's the first sin, the sin that Adam and Eve committed, the sin of pride. And then all of the other vices are depicted as growing out of that one sin. And so oftentimes, if you go to, for example, the Rule of St. Benedict, where he's counseling monks about how to behave, he will talk about one sin leading to another. It's interesting because in the chapter on sloth, which we'll get to eventually, Benedict is particularly vocal about that, and he is clear that sloth is going to lead to pride. There's a connection. And so, yeah, I do think that they are all somehow, there's a bridge between them. And oftentimes, I imagine if someone is guilty of excess in one, they probably struggle with at least one of the others as well.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder, like in the world we live in today, with be it Ukraine or you know the some of the ideas of our leaders, or there's so many examples of all of these sins being played out on the world stage around us. And you spoke about how there was a who was it that you just spoke about that the tree of life, or not the tree of
The
life,
tree of
but
vices.
the tree of vices. So I see forms of artwork being symbolic of the different vices. Maybe what we are living in today is a form of artwork where all around us we see these vices, and it's our job to say this is horrible over here. This is an example of this. What can we learn from this? And maybe all these things are happening so that we can show the next generation this is what can happen, but here's what we can do to do it.
Yeah.
And what is your thoughts on that?
But the problem is we don't learn. We don't seem to learn. We have terrible memories. We don't learn. And oftentimes our reaction to that is, instead of learning, we want to punish.
Mm.
And again, it's about, the difference between internal and external, right? Learning would be about me, making me better. Punishing is about punishing the person who's doing whatever it is. That's not going to help me. It's not going to help me at all. But, going back to the discussion about the leaders, I mean, in the US, our sort of really our terms for a lot of these positions, I mean, 4 years for a president, it's not a long time. A president doesn't have a long time to get anything accomplished. And I'm oversimplifying the job of a president, but I mean, a president gets elected, and in that first term, by year 3, they're already campaigning to be reelected, and then they're reelected, and automatically they're a lame duck. How are we getting anything accomplished? It's kind of
Yeah.
amazing that anything happens. And that happens at so many different levels in our government structure, at the national and the state and the local level, where you wonder how we're able to accomplish anything. But I think it is, you're right in, we should be learning, but we don't seem to be. I mean, what do historians always tell us about learning from the past, right? We don't seem to be doing a very good job of that. I was having coffee this morning with a good friend, and we were talking about what's going on in Ukraine and what should be done. And I say, I don't know. I waffle back and forth between, we should be intervening, we should be doing something to help, and we're not the world's police. And I can't figure out which way to go. But of course, nagging in the back of my mind almost daily is World War II, which the US sat out of until we were attacked. And I just wonder, I hope not, but is that what it's going to take to get us involved in this and to stop what is clearly becoming a genocide?
Yeah, they say the world maybe doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if you were to look at some of the similarities between, we had the world's greatest, or you could say that Werner von Braun was the world's greatest rocket scientist, and he created a rocket, but really it was a military delivery system. You could also argue that what's happening today is Elon Musk is the world's greatest rocket scientist, and he has a satellite system. But I think you can make a fair argument that that is also a weapon.
Sure.
And you can see so many similarities happening, but I hold strong to my belief in the goodness of people, that what we are witnessing is an opportunity for us to see things the way they've never been and say, why not? Like, why can't we come to terms? Why can't we put everything out in the open and have a debate, or at least like what else is happening there that we're not aware of? Are people trying to steal resources from there? Is this something that's been festering for a while that we are being shown one side of? And
well, and I think that's the key, though. I mean, for me, what makes us unique as human beings is potential.
Yes,
we are living potential.
Yeah.
And whether or not we fulfill that potential or even attempt is entirely in our hands. We could sit on our hands and just say, well, I'm not going to do anything. Or we could try to become functionaries of potential. And Paul Valery talks about potential a lot in his prose, and the fact that human beings, we are about potential. The potentiality of our existence is what's so unique about us being human. It separates us from anything else really that exists. And it's always disappointing / depressing when you see somebody who is not living up to their potential, or who is not challenging themselves to live up to their potential, and is just instead sort of happy to sit back on mediocrity. I'm talking here because after 3 decades in higher ed, right, I deal a lot with educating and students and convincing students of their potential. Oftentimes they come in and they feel like, some teacher in high school told me I was a bad writer, and so they believe that. It's like, well, wait a minute, what? Why? And can't that change? Right? I mean, so even if you were a bad writer, quote unquote, whatever the hell that means, why does that mean that you're condemned now? Why can't you change? Why can't you improve? We are about potential. So if you have at the age of 18 decided I'm a bad writer and that's it, we're going to put that on your tombstone, right? You're done. You're done. You're never going to. So you're telling me you've given up. You've thrown up your hands and said, that's it. I can't do it. And I always tell a student who tells me that, who'll say, some high school English teacher told me I was a bad writer. And I'll say to them, so you're basing your entire existence as a writer on the opinion of one person. How crazy is that? And I only realized that myself when I started teaching, and I would go in to see my mentor after a really bad day in the classroom and tell him about some student who was really giving me a hard time. And I would say, I'm a lousy teacher. And you start questioning your entire existence. And he would say to me, you're basing your entire existence on one person's opinion. And that's nuts. Really, the only person that I have to live up to, and the only person's expectations that I need to live up to, are my own. And I don't know about you, but I mean, my expectations for myself are pretty darn high, which itself could be a problem. But I think that the opposite is even worse if you have no expectations of yourself, right? And you're just happy just to sort of exist. What a boring life one would lead to live like that, to never see one's potential. I was always amazed when the first time I visited the United Kingdom, and I was on the London Underground, and was just stunned by the fact that just about everybody sitting there is reading a book, and not, and they're reading like literature. I was like, wait a minute, I don't see that on the New York City subway. What's going on over here? And sure enough, when you would take the escalator to go down to the London Underground, on the wall would be posters for new books that were coming out. And of course, any little village you go to throughout England has usually a pub, general store, and a bookstore. It's just part of the culture. And we in the US have moved so far away from living that kind of an intellectual existence. And maybe technology certainly hasn't helped it. People are happy to sit and just, stare at their phone for hours. But boy, we could be so much more productive than that. And we have potential. We have the potential.
We do.
$6 million man, right? We can rebuild him. We have the potential.
I think so. I really think, like, I believe this in my soul, that what you're going to see come out of the Ukraine and Russia is going to be something beautiful. I know it's so difficult for people to think about that right now, but I believe, like, I have faith in all of us as humans, and I have faith that humanity's better side is going to prevail. And I see this as like a test right now for all of us. Like, here's this side saying this, and here's this side saying this. But when I look into the eyes of the Russian people or the Ukrainian people, I see myself, and I see people that are scared and that have pride, but I also see people that have hope and that they want change. And I think that the pressures to put us at war are such a small few, and they're just feeding the fear and anger of these two sides to get them to do things that they really don't want to do. And I know in my heart that what we're going to see come out of this is going to be something that's beautiful. And as someone is like a scholar like you, I have read so many accounts of people that in the madness of war, they find community. Like if you read back at some of the accounts of people, they say, you know, although there were bombs going off here and there, it was the best time of my life. I
Mm.
was around the people that I cared about. Have you heard those experiences before?
I have, not in recent years.
Yeah, not in recent years.
I mean, I've heard them come out of. I mean, I've heard accounts of that come out of World War II.
Right.
Um, but it just seemed that we were more united, and I mean, we as in people, not Americans. We
Right.
were more united as human beings. And again, maybe this is part of the fault of technology, of sending us all to our own little corners, that we are increasingly losing our connection to other people. And so as a result, when something like this occurs, it makes it even more difficult to come together. It was wonderful. I guess it was last week, I think, that we raised the Ukrainian flag here on campus, and we had a fantastic turnout for the event. Everybody very supportive. Um, but I think that when it came down to it, most people walked away from that feeling good. But then if they were anything like me, walking back to my office, it was like, okay, now what? Right? I mean, that was a kumbaya moment. We all felt good about it. I'm glad we did it. The flag is flying out there. It's a symbol of our support, but it's a symbol.
Yeah.
And symbols aren't going to save people. Symbols aren't going to save people. Symbols are not going to save the people of Kharkiv, whose city is being bombed as we're talking. Symbols aren't going to do it. They're nice, but we need action. And we need to figure out what it is that we can do, actually do. That active verb, do. What can I do, right, to make a change and to help people? And maybe it's small things. Maybe it's things that just affect one person. Last summer, going back to my neighborhood, there was another homeless couple who showed up in the summer. They would stand out on the corner of one of the blocks that I drive past every day. Every day they were there, the two of them, a relatively young couple. And the young woman had a very high forehead. And I was really worried because it was the middle of summer and the sun was just beating down on them. And, I could have given them $10. I mean, I'm sure over the time I probably did give them some money. I don't remember. But the thing that I do remember consciously doing is one day I brought her a baseball cap because I said, I'm really worried about your skin sitting out here in this boiling sun day to day to day. And she hugged me. She was very grateful and very thankful. And I was disappointed because the next day when I saw them, she had given the hat to the guy which I thought was kind of interesting. But maybe it's just about helping one person. Maybe that's all we can do at our level, right? I'm not the president. I'm not a senator. Maybe I can only help one person, and maybe in just doing that and making that effort, I'm contributing to some kind of, cosmic karma. Here, I'll get all new agey.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, I should have tapestries behind. Maybe it's part of that, right? We're just contributing. I mean, and that's what Jung is talking about, right? Is
Right.
this collective unconscious is this kind of ongoing universal thing that we're a part of. And when we agree to engage in that, I think we become better human beings.
Yeah. Do you remember there was a sort of a koan? Am I saying that right? Like a
The
sort
con,
of a
yeah.
I think it was, gosh darn it. Do you know that one offhand that the Young referred to the Bible in sort of a koan?
Oh yeah.
Is it Genesis 18:23?
Yeah, I think I characterized it as a koan.
You did. Yes.
About what the line was. Hang on a second. I know
Yeah.
what page it's. I know which side of the book it's on. So,
Yeah.
oh,
It's
here, he
okay.
cited there's a midrash, a Jewish text on Genesis 18:23, which says, "If thou desirest the world to endure, there can be no absolute justice. Well, if thou desirest absolute justice, the world cannot endure. Yet thou wouldst hold the cord by both ends, desiring both the world and justice."
What does that make you think about Ukraine?
We want it all. We want it all. We want to have it all. We want there to be justice, and um we want the world to be the way that it is, a nicer, calmer, kinder place. But I mean, what are we talking about over the last couple of weeks? I mean, again, we're not looking necessarily at the sin, we're looking at the sinner. So what are we already talking about? Well, prosecuting Putin for war crimes, right? That is going to help somebody who died in Kharkiv.
Right. It's never going to happen either.
No,
Right.
but but that's what we're talking about, right? Instead of how do we help these people and stop the war, we're already thinking about, well, how are we going to how are we going to what is the punishment for this?
Yeah. It's faulty to think that we have any sort of control over that. And then,
Yeah,
what do we send weapons to them? And then how many innocent people die because we build
yeah.
weapons and send them over there, and it's
I mean, the problem is that we're dealing, as we have so often, with someone who is so sure that he's right that really there's no talking to them, and we all know people like that, right?
yeah,
There's just no convincing them otherwise. And I think that the real trick here is how do we deal with people like that? Whether they're living in our house or whether we work with them or whether they're, running one of the largest countries in the world. How do you deal with someone who's so sure that they're right, that they are just unwilling to listen to any other viewpoint?
I think the only way to do that is to try to understand why they think that. Like, regardless of what people like, they have a reason. It might not be
Yeah.
a good reason, but they have a reason. And if you can listen to them or allow them to say what their reason is, at the
Yeah.
very least, you could understand their motivations. And
Yeah. Well, I
understanding
mean, you
that, right?
mentioned correlation and causation earlier,
Yeah,
right? If we knew
absolutely.
the cause, yeah. But oftentimes, especially when it comes to the way that the human mind works, causes are confusing and unclear.
Yeah.
Why we do things. I mean, why do I eat something when I know I shouldn't? Right? I mean, it's all kinds of things like that. I mean, I always joke with students if they have an 8 o'clock class, your alarm goes off and you roll over and you go, oh, I got to go to class, and it's so nice and cozy here. I don't want to go to class. I always joke with them, and they don't get it because they're young. The scene in Animal House where he has devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, trying to cajole him into making one choice over another. And it's really what it comes down to. It's how do we make the choices that we make? Why do we make the choices that we make? And that why question, that's a tough one, right? Why do we do what we do? Why do people do what they do? I mean, oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I'm baffled by why people do what they do. And I'm not even talking about, somebody ordering the invasion of another country. I'm talking just about, everyday stuff. So we're a curiosity as a species, to be sure, but
Yeah.
I think we're pretty interesting as a curiosity, and without it, existence would be pretty boring.
Yeah. I I think there's something to be said about it. I wish that instead of people going and watching, 50,000 people watching football, that 50,000 people would fill a debate stadium and we could hear people talk about why you think this and why you think that. And
Yeah,
imagine having Putin and, you know, Zelensky on a stage and each one given an hour to present their case of why they're doing what they're doing and
yeah,
who's representing them. And imagine if that was on CNN and Fox for 4 hours a day and you could listen to the different people debating. Like, we would live in such a better world where people could express their ideas and it was brought to you by Pfizer, you know. You know, you can have this debate that was sponsored about things. And I think we're close to that. Like the technology that we have
Yeah,
could present us with something like that. And
sure. I mean, it's more easily done now than ever before, right?
yeah.
I
Yep.
mean, the idea when you go back and study, the histories of World War I and World War II, and look at what the machinations that had to be put in place to get those leaders in the same room. We don't have to worry about that now, right?
Yeah.
Turn on your camera. We've got Zoom, right?
Yeah.
We can talk that way.
Exactly. I'm gonna try to find a representative from like the Russian Orthodox Church. Maybe if I can find one, we could all,
Hmm,
you, him, and I could have a talk together.
that would
That
be
would be
very interesting.
fascinating,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
To hear a man of faith from a different place in the world
Yeah,
telling you, "Hey, well, here's how I see the sunrise, or here's how I see the sunset." And
that
I bet you we would see in him the same dreams and the same desires that we see in ourselves, that we see in the mirror, right?
it's just a different perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's a different perspective on the same thing. Right? We're
Yeah.
looking at the same thing. We just see it differently.
I agree. I want to. How you doing on time? Are you?
I got to go soon because I got another meeting coming up.
I figured so. Well,
Yeah,
I really enjoy talking to you, and I
as
think that
do I.
I think that the things that you've talked about so far are going to help more people than you possibly know, and I'm grateful for your time. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we end today's session?
No, next week we're on to gluttony, so get your fast food ready because we're gonna talk about the pains of gluttony that we have experienced in the last 100 years and how we might cope with it today. So
Fair enough. Okay, well, all your links are below. The book is Seven Deadly Sins, and we're on number 3, moving to number 4. And thank you so much for being here and spreading a little bit of aloha and some love to all my listeners. And I hope your day is phenomenal from here on out. So thank you
you
for
as
your
well,
time
George.
today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Okay, aloha.